For this final video in this series, I am going to go through another type of adjustment or another type of utility that is very useful. And in this case, we're going to look at how to control things like blur or grain or things of that nature. Because right now, the biggest problem that I've got with my CG car, I've matched the color up fairly nicely. However, if you look at the background, how blurry and soft things are. Even the foreground here, the image is relatively blurry. My car is not. It's sharp. And if I zoom in, it's sharp and pixelated too because of the resolution. So it just feels too sharp based on what I see around it. And it makes it feel, again, not quite as convincing and a little bit more CG than I would like it to be right now. Also, there's a bit of grain in my shadow that's a bit too much. There's obviously grain in the pavement, which helps, and it kind of works, but my grain is a little bit too noticeable and too sharp, so I need to soften that as well. So I'll deal with the shadow first. So here's where just understanding your node graph is really important. If I want to blur the shadow, I need to add a node after the shadow itself. Not the car, not the ambient occlusion, not the background. I've got to make sure I control the blur on the shadow only. So where you put the nodes are actually very, very important. So there is a blur node, which is that's all we need to do. So I'm going to select the shadow layer. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go into, again, this is one of those ones I always use the hotkey for, so I'm trying to remember which level it's in. Is it under transform? Nope. It's under filter, probably. Yeah. Under filter, blur, and you can see the hotkey for that is B. So I'm going to choose that. And it's going to move this over. There's a really cool function with Nuke. Because the read for the shadow and for the background are both plugged into blur, there's a kind of parent-child relationship there. If I control drag blur, everything that's plugged into it will come along for the ride. Actually, sorry, only the shadow is plugged in. I spoke wrong there, which I should know better. So control drag will plug in, will move everything on the downstream side of the graph. I'm just going to line this up a bit better so I can just organizing it as I go so it just looks appealing. But like I said, the order of connections is what's important, not the arrangement of the graph. But you definitely want to arrange your graph in a way that's visually pleasing and easy to understand, especially if you're working with other people. So I've got the blur here. It's after shadow. So like all the other ones, plugging it in is not enough. I've got to actually change the blur value. So size right now is 0. If I crank that up and look at the shadow, so there's 0. And I can blur that to oblivion if I want to. So you can see a little bit goes a long way. I don't want to get rid of the grain totally. I just want to soften it a little bit. So I'm going to turn the blur up just to about here. So it looks more like the same level of blur as the pavement around it. So that's looking pretty good there now. Now, another thing you can do is look at that individually, because right now we're looking at the final result, because you can see this multiply node, this merge multiply, which is the result of all this together, is what we're looking at right now. If I want to see just the blur, all I've got to do is select the blur, hit 1, and it's going to plug that into the viewer directly, and I can see what blur is doing all by itself. Now we got to remember, in this case, shadow only doesn't have any pixels in the color layers. They're all in the alpha channel. So in order to see what the blur is doing, I need to look at the alpha, which, if you recall, is the A key. Or you can go to the drop down up here and switch from RGB to alpha. Now I can see the blur affecting the pixels for the shadow directly. So if I want to adjust it here, you can see very clearly what the blur is doing. And so obviously here it's too grainy and sharp and looks like a noise almost. Whereas if I go this far, it's too soft and blurry. That's way blurrier and soft than the actual image is. So I'm finding a happy medium where I can still see that roughness, but it's just a lot softer. And then with that done, I'm going to go back to RGB and then plug the viewer back into my last merge node there to see the final result. So now we're going to do the same thing to our car layer. I'm just going to move this over, make some room, give myself a little bit more room here so I can add a blur node after saturation. Oops, wrong one. I'm going to right click, go down to filter, blur, or the B key. Just bring that over there. And I'm going to now blur the car and do the same thing to the car in hopes that it will look a little bit more matched to the background. So again, I could blur it to oblivion, or I could just softly blur it just enough so that it feels like, now I don't want to blur it so much that it looks strange. This is the hero of the shot, so I still want to make it visible. So I'm just going to tone it down just a few percent. So you can see 2 or 3% is probably fine. Yeah, 3's too much. I'm going to go maybe 1 actually. Now I should be labeling these, so blur 1, I'm going to double click on it. I'm going to call it shadow blur. And I'm going to go to blur 2, call it car blur. I should have labeled my color corrections. So I'm going to call the grade car grade car desaturation, and then shadow blur is already labeled. So again, I'm labeling that. When I grade your guys' assignments, I am going to be looking to see that you've labeled your nodes. You will definitely lose marks if you're not labeling your nodes. So keep that in mind, please. And last but not least, I've blurred the car, and you can see this more dramatically if I crank it up. Notice how if I blur the car, I can still see this kind of weird ghost of it that's not blurred. That's the ambient occlusion. It's a separate node. So blurring the car will not blur the ambient occlusion. So I'm just going to undo that to make it a little bit less dramatic. Oh, actually, I'm glad this happened. I just accidentally hit the, I think it was the C key. Or no, the Z key, which is the hotkey to switch cameras to this front view. Don't panic. If you see this happen, all you got to do is hit the hotkey to go back to standard mode, which is tab. So Z is front camera, which is a 3D view, and then tab will get you back to standard view, or this drop down here also has all of your cameras along with hotkeys. So 2D is what we want. I meant to hit Control Z to undo, and I hit Z by accident. So careful with your camera switching. But yeah, this drop down here will allow you to get back if you forget the hotkeys. Okay, so it's going to blur the car a bit more so it's obvious. So I want to blur the ambient occlusion as well. Now, one cool thing I can do is I can reuse this blur. I don't want to blur the ambient occlusion at a different level. I want to blur them both the same amount. So I can actually just copy and paste the blur I already have. So I'm going to select the blur, Control C for copy. I'm going to select the ambient occlusion and hit Control V for paste. And I should rename it right away. So I'm going to call it AO blur. Now the ambient occlusion has the same level of blur as the car. The last thing I'm going to show you here is how to create what's called an expression. The AO and the car blur are a perfect example of that. I want these to always be the same. And if I change one of them, I want them all to change. So what I can do is I can generate an expression between the two, so that if I update the car blur, the ambient occlusion blur will automatically get updated. But if I do it that way, I have to make sure that I remember which one's in charge. So I'm going to make the car blur the one that's the important one, and I'm going to make the AO blur a slave. To do that, first I'm going to clear my grid here, because again, this is starting to get confusing again. And I want to work with both of these nodes, so I want to make sure I'm not making any mistakes. So I'm going to hit the white X to clear, and then I'm going to double click on both of them one at a time. So I'm going to bring in the AO blur first, because it's the slave, and then I'm going to double click on the car blur as well, and they're both here. So car blur, AO blur. The size is the value that controls how blurry it is, and you can see it's right now they're set the same. But if I change one of them, the other one doesn't automatically update. I'm going to undo that. I want to create a connection between the two, so that whenever I adjust car blur, the AO blur gets the same value. To do that, I'm going to create an expression. An expression is just a little bit of code that makes a connection between two objects. And you don't actually need to know how to do the code. You can just drag and drop to do it. And quite simply, all you have to do is at the end of the slider, you see this little box that has a squiggly line. You can see there's a bunch of them here. That's essentially your key option. So if I click on that, I'll get all these options that are all to do with setting keyframes and adjusting them. If I control drag from the keying options of my car blur down to the keying options of my AO blur, the AO blur will turn blue, and if you look in the viewport, you can see a green line with an arrow that's pretty much shows there's a connection, and the arrow shows which one's in charge. And now, if I adjust car blur, because there's an expression between these two, so if I set the car blur to 5, you can see the AO blur is set to 5. If I set the car blur to 10, the AO blur is set to 10. And that's pretty much all there is to it. You can take any two values in Nuke and create expressions between them to make these types of connections. If I could have 20 blurs on different things and have them all being driven by one of them by dragging the expression to all of them. So you can drive multiple nodes with the same data if need be. In this case, I've only got the two. I don't want to include the shadow in this because the shadow is disconnected from the car, and I do want the ability to adjust the blur of the shadow separately from the blur of the AO and the car, which are connected together. They're the exact same object, therefore they should share the same blur value. Okay, that pretty much sums up the this kind of short series as an intro to Nuke and the basic workflow that you guys are going to have to follow to get through the Nuke portion of your assignments for this semester. I will be doing some more topics and releasing them at a later date that take some of this a little bit further and look at some other workflows that we haven't touched on yet. But to get us started, if you can go through this process however many times it takes to get from start to finish with your own objects and data as to what I've got here, thinking about the same types of information as you build it, if you can get that down, you will be fine with Nuke for the rest of the way, because no matter what you do, no matter what the scene is, your basic build structure of what functions you need is always going to be the same. You're always going to have the same 4 basic layers at the very simplest form merged together as your starting point. And then once you've got that merging done, you're always going to bump in other nodes to do to make adjustments as needed. But the process will never change. It'll always kind of start the same way. Now, you'll have different levels of color correction and blur and on all that sort of stuff, but that's a decision that's based on a project per project basis.